Hello everyone, welcome to another video. In this video, we will discuss some important best practices while developing plugin processes or server-side code. Normally, developers most of the times do not follow the best practices. Because of that, down the line, they have to pay for the code, right? So it is solution architect and the lead's responsibility to review the code before it is published for production, and also at the same time the developer should ensure about the best practices if that has been followed correctly or not. The first best practice you have to ensure is do not use batch request types in plugins or custom workflow activities. What does it mean? It means that there are two types of batch processing system available in our server-side code. Okay, one is execute multiple request, another is execute transaction request. These two types of request processing takes longer time for processing, and also because of its long running nature, some plugin code, the code that you have written, is actually exposed sandbox isolated plugins. And if you have written any code using this execute multiple request and execute transaction request, then your performance will be degraded. That's why do not use this batch processing code in your plugin. And also sometimes people use execute transaction request but to ensure that the processes that are running in batch will ensure isolation or ensure the single transaction. But plugin itself is running in a transaction, so that rollback is possible. So do not need to use extra layer of execute transaction request, right? So when to use batch processing, it's very important to understand. We understood that batch processing code should be avoided in our plugin, right? We should not use in our plugin. Then when to use execute multiple request, which is a bulk data processing, is only to be used in your batch processing which you have written in console application or external applications. Okay, if you written any external applications and any console application which are running externally, you can use execute multiple process. But inside plugin in event pipeline, you should not add any batch processing. You can use execute multiple requests to minimize round trip. Normally what happens whenever you call a server through create, update any message, it is considered as a one round trip, right? So if you want to connect, if you want to create 4 records, that means you need 4 round trip, right? But execute multiple request is a batch processing. Because of that, it minimizes the round trip. That is a benefit, but you should not add in the plugins, but it can be added in the external code where you need to minimize the round trip between custom client and dynamic server or Dataverse server, which can reduce the cumulative latency that is incurred, but not in the plugins. In the external applications, what are the external applications? You can ask console applications, which is a C# console application is an external application. You have written some web application externally, right? So these are external applications not running in the event pipeline execution model. Next is execute transaction request. When you can use execute transaction request, it is used only for external clients that requires the batch processing or batch operation that to be committed as a single atomic transaction. But plugin is always running under one atomic transaction. If anything happens in the plugin, it rolls back, right? If any error. So you do not need to write another layer of transaction request to make your batch processing atomic. Okay, so if you are not writing a plugin, you are writing any console application or external application, to ensure your batch processing or request processing should be in a atomic or single transaction, use execute transaction request. Okay, so that any error in the transaction request processing, it will also roll back your changes. Understood? The first is very important. The first is to avoid using batch processing in the plugins and workflow activities. Number 2 is develop iPlugin implementation as stateless. Most of the times, because of ignorance or because of the knowledge of best practices, people write class level members. Okay, iPlugin is a, plugin is a class which implement interface iPlugin, right? So most of the times, if you write member function and data members for classes in plugins, it will generate data inconsistency, and also the performance will be slower. Okay, another reason why we should not use data members and member functions in the plugin class is multiple system threads can execute in the same time, and said most of the times the plugin is executed multiple times, and multiple system thread could execute the same said plugin instance, right? So when a plugin instance is shared concurrently by multiple execution, then it will cause problem if you have exposed or implemented any class level member functions and data members. This opens up members of classes that implement iPlugin to potential thread safety issues. In plugin, if you implement any data member and member function which are class level, they are potentially increase the thread safety issues in the plugins, okay, which leads performance issues. Now let us understand this here. In this example, you see here in the plugin class we have used a iOrganization service object and iPlugin execution context, which are class level member functions and data members, right? Before execute, if you have written anything, any declaration, that means it is class level declaration, and you should avoid this. Okay, and this is a violation pattern, and it causes potential performance problems and also thread safety issues in the plugin. Understood? Second number, which is very important also, including the first one. The third one is to remember that do not duplicate plugin steps. Most of the times when we create steps in our plugin registration tool, what we do, we create steps for a plugin, right? So when we create a step, there is a chance that we can also add another step as a duplicate step, right? So duplicate steps will fire multiple times on the same message. What will happen then? If you have created a duplicate steps for a plugin, it will delay processing of asynchronous jobs, right? If you have registered any asynchronous process or plugin, then the execution will be delayed, and also it degrades the performance, user performance, because it runs multiple times. Okay, and what users will experience if this type of code has been implemented, this type of duplicate steps has been registered? The model driven apps will be unresponsive. This will be hanged. The model driven app will be hanged if the plugin is executed multiple times. Slow client interactions, and the browser stops responding. So if you feel this type of symptoms, you have to review instantly your plugin code and registration tool about their correct configuration. And most important error you get in this is SQL deadlock. You can get errors like SQL generic errors, deadlocking, all these things it will generate, because the plugin code will try to execute multiple times. Okay. So here you see how you can duplicate, how normally people duplicate. Update of account is already given, another update of account, so the step is duplicated. and you should avoid this. Number 4, do not use parallel execution within plugins and workflow activities. It is very generic and very usual that we always think of making our logic or making our code to run faster, isn't it? So that's why the parallelism comes into picture. Multi-threading, parallel execution, that are concept of to making our code to run faster, to execute our logic parallelly. Okay, if your code does not require sequential processing, you can use parallelism. But multi-threading or parallel calls within plugins can cause corruption of connections. Okay, so sometimes you can get the errors like generic SQL error in your plugin if you have written any multi-threading or a parallel execution codes. Okay, so you have to avoid any code that is executed or depend on multi-threadings or parallel library or task-based asynchronous patterns. Okay, as plugins and customer workflow runs in a single transaction or a isolated a one transaction, multiple threads introduced by parallel execution can corrupt the transaction. You see, so if you implement multiple threads using multiple threading and parallel processing, because plugins and customer workflow runs on a single transaction, it may corrupt the transaction, which is very risky, right? So the following example patterns should be avoided. So if you have any code written through multi-threading or parallelism, you have to refresh or remove your code and redesign by following these best practices. Number 5, implement all types of queries when filtering results using pre-operation retrieve multiple. Okay, so there are many types of data fetching request, isn't it? Fetch expression, query expression, right? So these are, and query by attribute, these are all expressions. So all types of queries that we use for filtering data should be on the pre-operation, should not be on the post-operation. Okay, and retrieve. So what is the symptom? Okay, why you need this best practice? Why you need? Because if a plugin is written to change the records returned in a specific application which uses just one type of query used by the application, either fetch expression or query expression, the results may not be consistent in other applications, or if the application changes the type of the query used, plugins should be written to provide the same result regardless of the application, right? So whatever application you are using, if you have written one type of query expression, then it may get the results differently in different application. So whenever you are implementing any type of query filtering, use in pre-operation and retrieve multiple. Okay, number 6, include filtering attributes with plugin registration. This is very, very important for performance point of view. Whenever you are running any plugin, most of the times we forget using filtering attribute. Okay, so filtering attribute selection will ensure that the plugins will only execute when the filtering attribute will be updated. It will not run on update of any field, rather it will only trigger whenever that specific filtering attribute will be updated. And here you see in the plugin registration step, whenever you add new step, you have an option called as filtering attributes, and here you have to define the list of attributes that can trigger a plugin. If you make it blank, or if you do not select for any field update on your record, the plugin will trigger, which is not expected, right? Unnecessarily, why you will trigger a plugin if there is the concerned or the target field is not changed? So this is very important to select filtering attribute while registering plugins. This is another important best practice people forget. Number 7, limit the registration of plugins for retrieve and retrieve multiple messages. You know that guys, plugin supports so many messages, right? Create, update, delete, retrieve multiple, and so on. So you can also register plugins in create, update, delete, and so on. Like that, you can also register your plugin in retrieve and retrieve multiple. But you should use your plugin in this retrieve and retrieve multiple with caution, because most of the times retrieve and retrieve multiple are those messages which are executed whenever we read or query any data from the server, right? When a view is loaded, when a form is loaded, every time retrieve multiple message is executed. So adding a synchronous plugin logic to the retrieve and retrieve multiple message event can cause slowness, right? So if you register any plugin in retrieve and retrieve multiple message, it will slow down the performance. Now what will happen if you add a synchronous plugin in retrieve multiple? The unresponsive model, the app will be unresponsive, slow client interaction, the browser will stop responding, right? So it is very important that avoid plugins to be registered in retrieve and retrieve multiple. If you find that is the only option that to be implemented and the plugin must be registered in the retrieve and retrieve multiple because there is no other way, then you have to follow some tips to minimize the impact. What are the tips? Number 1 is include conditions in the plugin code to quickly check if the targeted logic needs to be performed. So you need to use conditions in the plugin to check the logic. If it does not, then return quickly. That means you have to write something conditional to return quickly. Okay? Refrain from executing unnecessary extra steps that will delay returning the data to the caller. So do not add any such code, extra steps that will delay the return data, because user is waiting to see the view and you have written a plugin to execute on the retrieve multiple, right? Next, avoid including long running tasks. If you've written anything in the plugin that are running long, avoid this, especially those that can be non-deterministic, such as invocation of external service calls, complex queries, right? So if you let's say you are calling an external service call and external service call response has no such definitive or deterministic timing. In that scenario, if you written a plugin, then the user will get slow performance and the system will be hanged. Next is limit or avoid querying for additional data from Dataverse. Okay, you can add some conditions to filter while returning data in plugin using retrieve and retrieve multiple, but do not retrieve any other data, additional data in the plugin, because it will cause again the slowness. Again this is very important to understand. Retrieve and retrieve multiple messages are two most important messages that are processed most of the times, right? When the retrieve message is triggered when you open a new entity form, and the retrieve multiple triggers when you open a view, right? So adding synchronous plugin logic to these message events can cause slowness. So the important thing is avoid this, but if that is the only option, use it with caution. Number 8, manage plugins in single solution. Most of the times developers create different solutions for different plugins, which is not the best practice. What is the best practice? Create a single .NET class library project and keep adding different class files that represent a plugin. So the definition of plugin assembly should be maintained within a single solution. One solution should be there for all plugins. you may want to have a separate solution that contains only plugins definitions to help manage the plugins. Now you can see here in my code I have a single solution and the single project, and I have 3 plugins. This is one plugin and this is one plugin, right? I have not created another project or solution to keep other plugins. Okay, so this is one class file and iPlugin interface. This is another class file and iPlugin interface, right? That means one single solution, multiple plugins, so that you can manage well. Next is optimize custom assembly development. How to optimize custom assembly development? Assemblies with a large number of custom workflow activities can take long time to upload, right? So if you have large number of custom workflow activities, you have to avoid this. Do not create assemblies or DLLs with large number of custom workflow activity. For example, this is a DLL that will generate one DLL, and inside this DLL you have added thousands or hundreds of custom workflow activities. That is not the best practice, right? Because custom workflow activities can take longer time for upload when registered. Multiple different custom assemblies. When you have multiple different custom assemblies, not a single assembly, it increase maintainability complexity and potential increase plugin execution length. And also sandbox assembly size constraint is 16 MB. For example, in our previous best practice, manage plugin in one single solution, you have followed this best practice, but in your solution you have added so many plugins and custom workflow that the size becomes more than 16 MB. Then it will show error, right? So sandbox assembly size must be 16 MB. If it is more than 16 MB, create another custom assembly, right? Otherwise it will show error. Consolidate plugins and custom workflow activities into a single assembly. Okay, so keep one solution and all plugins and custom workflow activities on the same solution, but make sure that it do not exceed than 16 MB. If it is, you have to create another assembly. Set keep alive to false when interacting with external host in plugin. There is a high chance that in our plugin we interact with external host or external web services or web APIs. In that case, you need to use a property of web request called as keep alive as true. Keep alive property is set to true in HTTP request header or not explicitly defined as false can cause increased execution times of plugins. So you have to keep it false so that it will not increase the execution time. If you do not specify, it will increase the execution time, which is not expected. So this is the best practice, important. If plugins makes external web request, these are some additional information of that best practice. If a plugin makes external web requests, is trying to use keep alive on a closed connection, the plugin will ultimately fail to execute the web request, right? So if the plugin is registered synchronously, user may experience unresponsiveness, slow performance, browser not responding, right? If it is asynchronous, plugin execution may take an extended period of time before it is fail, right? The point here is keep alive flag must be mentioned as false. Number 11, set timeout when making external calls in plugin. It is very important to take special care whenever your plugin calls an external service, because you do not have a deterministic timeline when to get a response. So you have to specify timeout if you are not getting a response from that server in a specific time, because plugin itself has 2-minute timeout. So it will time out, it will automatically time out after 2 minutes, right? So if a plugin makes external web request, that fails to respond quickly, the plugin will wait for a full default timeout period before failing. This duration may cause a long transaction that can affect other operations. If other operations are dependent on your plugin execution completion, then they will be waiting and it will affect. Okay. If the plugin is synchronous, then what symptom you will get? If you have not used timeout, unresponsiveness, slow client interaction, browser non-responding, right? If it is asynchronous, then your plugin will wait for extended time. This is how you can specify timeout. Whenever you are calling HTTP clients, you have to use client.timeout and specify the timeout here, right? This is the best practice you have to use, and also you have to use keep alive as false. Number 12, use invalid plugin execution exception in plugin and workflow activities. Whenever you think that you have to throw a custom error, plugin error, you have to use invalid plugin execution exception, right, to throw an error so that it will roll back. If a synchronous plugin returns an exception other than invalid plugin execution exception back to the platform, in Power Apps client an error is displayed to the user with a message of the exception message and stack trace. This provides a unfriendly user experience, right? Whenever the error will not display proper friendly message, it is unfriendly, right? So if invalid plugin execution exception is not thrown, but it's thrown a generic normal way, it will not display friendly message. So it is frustrating to find out the exact error. So it is best practice that whenever you catch the errors, handle the error and throw invalid plugin execution exception so that it will intentionally give the proper friendly message, error message, with which will intentionally cancel the operation. Okay. Number 13 is using eye tracing service in plugin. Most of the times when you find runtime errors, it is difficult to troubleshoot production plugins. So it is best practice that use tracing service to log information so that we can debug and troubleshoot plugin issues and its behavior. So we use the eye tracing service with our plugins to gain insights into what happens within our code, right? Which line is executing correctly, which line is not, after which line the error occurs, right? So all these things we can get. So the tracing service interface assists developers by recording runtime custom informations as a diagnostic purpose so that we can identify the behavior of the plugin, and before writing the trace service we must extract the tracing service object as we write in our plugin, and then we have to enable the plugin trace in the system settings, and we can check the eye tracing information or tracing information that has been logged. So this is how the code is written, eye tracing service, and in the eye tracing service object we use trace method to log the messages. Number 14 is verify certification dependencies for plugins making outbound calls. You have to verify the certification dependency. If multiple plugins are interdependent, then you have to verify the certification for the plugin when an outbound call is initiated. Okay, this is for SSL certificates while calling or multiple dependency plugins are called, right? So this is all about the best practices, 14 best practices that you have to remember, and very, very important, all these things. I hope you understood, and next time you should take well care of the best practices while developing plugins and customer flow activities. Thanks everyone watching this video. See you next time. Bye guys. If you have not subscribed, please subscribe and click the bell icon for notification. Thank you.